Introduction. There is a purist view of art, according to which it would be futile to categorize literature at all. According to this view, the best art, and literature is a form of it, transcends national boundaries, both geographical and ideological. As such, it would be paradoxical to speak of, say, American and Russian literature. Either it is literature, an art form of the purest kind, or it is not. And from this point of view, with which Henry James would have agreed but many others would not, it appears chauvinistic to set out to study Pakistani literature in English. This is what Zulfikar Ghosh, an expatriate writer of Pakistani origin, must have had in his mind when to my question who, in his opinion, were the best writers from India and Pakistan, he replied, "I do not know enough of their work to have an opinion. I must repeat that I despise labels. Categories are for clerks in bureaucracies and have nothing to do with art. The worst category invented for writers is the nationalistic one, as though some sort of literary Olympic Games were in progress. A writer is interested in the best literature, wherever it comes from, and a writer, who makes a special place in his reading for the works of his countrymen and women, has to be one who is more interested in a who's who type of gossip than he is in his art." Ghosh's acerbity of tone, and the assertion that literature must not be given critical attention for non-literary reasons is, of course, justified. This has been done too often, as we shall see in the following survey of trends in the criticism of Third World literature in English. The problem of evaluation has assumed political rather than aesthetic forms in Third World literatures to a degree quite unprecedented in modern English literature. The critical debate in the new literatures in English is, in the last analysis, connected with colonialism. It was colonialism which created cultural arrogance among European critics and a corresponding sense of inferiority among the colonized. Now, in a reversal of this pattern, the Europeans tend to be patronizing and the Third World critics chauvinistic and ethnocentric. The first issue which rises in this connection is whether these new literatures are indeed so different from English literature as understood traditionally, as to call for different criteria of evaluation. The problems referred to are aspects of a general problem of evaluation. Is this new body of writing to be judged as an extension of literature in English, and by the international standards associated with it, or does it, for cultural and linguistic and possibly other reasons, require some quite different critical basis? Readers of Transition will recall that the correspondence columns for a long time carried an argument about the impudent assumption by non-Africans that they could criticize African authors. But even if the literatures are distinctive wholes, and certainly their themes and sensibility does support this view, it does not follow that non-literary criteria should be used to evaluate them. Modern African literature came to be given critical attention in the West in the 1950s. A number of reviews were written by anthropologists whose interest was anthropological rather than artistic. One critical term which was often used was simplicity. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, 1958, was said to be simple, and the emphasis was on the informative, as opposed to the artistic, value of the novel. Keith Waterhouse, while referring to Achebe's No Longer at Ease, 1960, said in the New Statesman, "We want a lucid, uncluttered account of the way life is changing in these territories. We want sound, competent craftsmen to put up the framework. Later, when the chronicles of change are more or less complete, some very fortunate writers indeed will be able to fill the framework in, wallowing in the new luxuries of characterization, motivation, depth, psychology, and all the rest of it." This evolutionary view of creativity is based on the assumption that the African is less sophisticated in his response to reality than his Western counterpart. Others argue that discrepant criteria should be used for evaluating Western and African literatures because the African sensibility cannot be expressed in Western literary forms. This hypothesis is based on the assumption that there are no universals, no possibility of transcendence of ethnocentric ways of apprehension, and, by implication, no such thing as a classic, a work of art which will appeal to people who do not belong to the culture in which it was first produced. This is an extreme interpretation of this culture-bound hypothesis. Here is one of the most balanced statements of this doctrine. It is unrewarding, therefore, for the non-African reader and critic to look at any of the three major genres in contemporary African writing, the novel, poetry, and drama, solely from the perspective of Western literary criteria and terminology. This is too much like trying to force a glove with 3 fingers onto a hand with 5. Instead, we must look at African writing not only for whatever similarities with Western literary forms may be, but also once we have fully identified these for what is different, and, therefore, African. This is only a roundabout way of saying that there can be different evaluative criteria for different kinds of literatures written in English, an assertion which can and has led to critical anarchy in the past and which must not be accepted without reservations. And one of these reservations is the political one, to be precise, the nationalistic one. Nationalism, again a consequence of colonization, has been a major force to reckon with in the Third World. In African countries too, the slogan that literature should serve the cause of nationalism has had its heyday. In the First Congress of Negro Writers in 1956, for example, a delegate exhorted African artists to try to look at art through politics. The Second Congress in 1959 held in Rome also emphasized the political basis of art. In the last few years, the artists themselves have been less willing to tolerate these prescriptive formulas and, as a consequence, the formulas have lost their force. African critics are, however, nationalistic and even question the right of non-Africans to criticize African literature. This is merely a political conflict, that between the colonizer and the colonized, which has taken a literary form and is expressed in the idiom of aesthetics rather than politics. In the West Indies, the Guyanese magazine KYH/UL 1945-1961 tried to stimulate a West Indian theory and practice of literary and cultural criticism. Another such magazine, The Beacon, 1931-1933, from Trinidad, insisted that West Indian writing should utilize West Indian settings, speech, characters, situations and conflicts. In other words, that it would not be imitative as it had been in the past. This was all a part of an effort to create authentic West Indian literature. But once such a literature was produced, the critical response to it was in many ways similar to that towards African literature. Very often certain themes, prominent because of historical experiences, are accepted as a criterion of value. Braithwaite, a famous West Indian writer, makes the fragmentation of West Indian culture and identity his major theme. And then this theme, or an extension of it, become a critical standard. Indeed, this notion of estrangement from one's community and landscape becomes in Braithwaite's various critical articles or surveys of West Indian writing the main criterion for judging individual Caribbean writers. Once again, one notices the tendency to judge literature in terms of ideas and themes related in some way or the other to the experience of colonization. And this tendency is also noticeable in the criticism of Indian literature in English by Indians. I will pay more attention to it because the cultural situation and the political forces influencing Indian critics are very similar to those which influence Pakistani critics. Thus, in order to understand what literary criteria should be used to evaluate Pakistani literature in English, it would be most relevant to understand what criteria have actually been used by Indian critics to evaluate Indian literature. Indian literature in English, like the other new literatures of the Third World, began as a consequence of the confrontation of India with the West. However, it was not a literature of protest but that of imitation in the beginning. Henry Desrosiers, 1809-1831, Kashiprasad Ghosh, 1809-1873, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, 1827-1873, and Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, 1838-1894, were some of the pioneers of Indian creative writing in English. But this writing was more derivative rather than creative. Ghosh and Dutt, according to William Walsh, were low-toned versions, the one of Ton Moore, the other of the lesser, romantic Byron. And Arbindo Ghosh, 1867-1924, wrote a delicate kind of Victorian lyric in Love Songs and Elegies, 1898. Even Sarojini Naidu, famous though she was, wrote merely meretricious pseudo-romantic verse in the style of the 90s. At first, barring encomiastic reviews, there was almost no Indian criticism of this literature. Bhupal Singh, the chronicler of Anglo-Indian fiction, did, however, add a brief appendix to his book about some Indian writers of fiction. Singh's book was published in 1934 and he has not mentioned any writer who gained fame later. Criticism began in earnest in the 1950s and K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar's book Study of Indian Writing in English, 1959, is one of the first major studies of Indian literature in English by an Indian critic. This book is being written to fill this gap. This book is historical as well as critical. It is this later aspect of it which is a source of its strength as well as weakness, Strength because criticism is always required to create the criteria for evaluating creative writing. Weakness because this criticism is a product of my personal judgment which could well be prejudiced, mistaken or erroneous. The mistake, however, will not proceed from chauvinism at least. I have, therefore, tried not to use non-literary criteria to evaluate literature. Whether a writer is, in any sense of the word, nationalistic, Islamic or traditionalist is of no relevance to the judgment of his work. Pakistani literature is being studied not for nationalistic reasons but simply because it too is one of the new literatures of the Third World written in the English language. The definition of Pakistani, therefore, is loose rather than strict, cultural rather than political. I have, for instance, included several works of expatriate writers like Zulfikar Ghosh, Hanif Qureshi and Tariq Mahmood, though some of them do not even call themselves Pakistani but are of Pakistani origin and their works are relevant to Pakistani literature. Some writers who have written prolifically have been given no critical attention, whereas others who have produced only one slim volume of verse or a collection of short stories have been commented upon. This has been done for one of the following two reasons. Either the writer has not collected his separate writings in a single collection or, and here my personal judgment comes in, I have not considered the work worthy of critical attention at all. In the latter case, the work has been mentioned in the bibliography and may be read and given a different interpretation by some other critic. If a work does exist in the form of a book and has not been mentioned in the bibliography, it has not been read by me and I would be most grateful if someone makes it available. However, I venture to add that such works will be very few indeed because I have made every effort to read every important literary work written by Pakistanis. I have confined myself to that part of the country which used to be called West Pakistan till the separation of 11 Bangladesh in 1971. Logically, the creative works of East Pakistan till 1971 should have been dealt with, but, unfortunately, they could not be procured in spite of my best efforts. It was because of this limitation that I decided to limit myself to that part of the country which is called Pakistan now. This is a history and the arrangement is chronological. I have started with pre-partition fiction and then proceeded to deal with the fiction of the 50s and so on till the late 80s. Poetry, drama and prose have been given separate chapters. Great literary figures too have been given separate chapters. The conclusion sums up the themes of Pakistani literature in English and attempts to compare this literature with other third world literatures. It is hoped that this book will generate interest in Pakistani literature and its criticism. It may also help the common reader as well as the specialist of Commonwealth or Third World literature in English to understand this new literature in the English language. This knowledge is useful not only for understanding the phenomenon of the rise of new literatures in English but also for understanding the nature of creativity itself. And that is a question which finally transcends all labels and all questions of nationality.